Good afternoon. Welcome to Nixon's the One, 1968 in America, a video documentary featuring numerous episodes on Nixon's campaign for the presidency in that pivotal year. Episode 1 focuses on Nixon's announcement as a presidential candidate on January 31, 1968, in a letter he mailed to the citizens of New Hampshire, a date which coincided with the launch of the Tet Offensive in South Vietnam by the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, which surprised the U.S. military. A little bit about Nixon's the One video project. It's based on a forthcoming book I'm writing called The Phoenix: How Richard Nixon Rose from Political Ashes to Win the Presidency in 1968. I hope to finish this book sometime early this fall. Nixon's the One is a series of episodes on Richard Nixon's campaign, centering on key developments in the turbulent year of 1968. Nixon had a remarkable career in American politics and still resonates nearly 80 years after having been on the national stage. I'm an admirer of Richard Nixon as a politician, even though I'm a lifelong Democrat who would have voted for Hubert Humphrey in 1968 had I been 21 years of age in that year. Let's look at Nixon's background, a thumbnail sketch of his biography. He was born in California on January 9th, 1913. He graduated from Duke Law School in 1937. He served in the U.S. Navy in World War II. He was elected to the House of Representatives from California in 1946 and served 2 terms. He was elected to the U.S. Senate from California in 1950 and served for 2 years. In 1952, he was picked by Dwight Eisenhower to be his vice president and ran on the ticket in that year and was elected and served 2 terms as vice president of the United States. In 1960, he received the Republican nomination for the presidency and ran and lost to John F. Kennedy. In 1962, he ran for the governorship of California, but was defeated by Pat Brown in that election. After his defeat, he moved to New York, where he started practicing law. He joined the law firm of Nixon, Mudge, Rose, Guthrie, and Alexander, where he practiced from 1963 to 1968. He was basically a rainmaker who tried to drum up business for the law firm and was quite successful in doing so. He was elected President of the United States on November the 5th, 1968, and served a term in office from January 20th, 1969, through his resignation on August the 9th, 1974. In addition to this episode dealing with Nixon's announcement for the presidency, 2 other episodes are forthcoming in this month of June 2024. One is on the New Hampshire primary, which will be released on June 19th. The other is on Lyndon Johnson's withdrawal from the presidential race, an announcement which shocked the nation, that will premiere on June 26th of this year. Nixon addressed a letter to the citizens of New Hampshire on January 31st, 1968, as I indicated, in which he acknowledged that the citizens of New Hampshire, who were quite familiar with him by this time, hardly needed to be reminded of how important the New Hampshire primary was, it being the first of primaries in the United States at that time, and vital to the future prospects of any presidential candidate. Nixon went on to say that during his 14 years in Washington, he learned a lot about the awesome responsibilities of the president And during his so-called wilderness years, those that he spent in the private sector from 1962 to 1968, he had studied the issues very carefully, traveled the world, and gained knowledge about what might be some of the solutions to the nation's problems, and wanted to offer them to the people of New Hampshire and the United States through his presidential candidacy. In 1968, when Nixon launched his campaign, most people regarded him as very well versed in foreign affairs, very knowledgeable as a candidate, and having had a lot of experience, had all the credentials on paper for the presidency. The big concern that some had about his candidacies, however, was that he had suffered two consecutive losses in elections in 1960 and 1962, and he had not, furthermore, successfully won office on his own since 1950, when he won a race for the US Senate in California. Nixon had to disabuse people's notion that he was a loser, and he promised to run in all the primaries, as you can see from his announcement that he made in New Hampshire. This is about February the 2nd, 1968, when he was giving a press hearing on his candidacy.
I recognize that I must demonstrate to the American people, to the Republican Party leaders, to the Republican Party voters at large throughout this country, to independents and to those Democrats who will vote Republican in 1968, that I can win and that I can do the job. I am prepared to meet that challenge. That's why I have decided that I will test my ability to win and my ability to cope with the issues in the fires of the primaries, and not just in the smoke-filled rooms of Miami. And I suppose this will sound like a statement of some conceit, but as you enter a campaign, you must go in with confidence, and I have great confidence, not cockiness, but confidence. I believe I'm going to win the New Hampshire primary. I believe I will come out the winner of, the decisive winner of the primaries, will go on to win the nomination, and if I do that, I will be the strongest candidate, and I believe I can beat Lyndon Johnson.
As I mentioned, Nixon's announcement on January 31st coincided with the Tet Offensive, which was a major invasion that North Vietnam launched on US forces in South Vietnam with the assistance of their Viet Cong allies in the South. It was a pivotal battle. Technically, the US military won the battle, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. The battle caused many in the United States to have grave reservations about the pursuit that we were following in Vietnam, and led to serious implications regarding how our military and various other diplomatic efforts in this regard would be conducted. The US Army put together this interesting visual video on the Tet Offensive, which gives you a flavor for the magnitude of the attack that the North Vietnamese with their Viet Cong allies launched on the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, Tet, in 1968. The most intense fighting occurred in this first phase of the Tet Offensive, which lasted until March 28, 1968, and it involved the attack on the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, which startled the American public. This was also a very consequential battle in which the North Vietnamese raised their flag at that particular city, and that caused great consternation among patriots in the United States and angered Lyndon Johnson tremendously. In February of 1968, there were several people presuming are actually declared as candidates for the presidency. George Romney, the governor of Michigan, who was first elected in 1962 and reelected in 1966, was the first to announce his candidacy in February of 1967 for the Republican nomination. Many considered him at the time to be the leading candidate for the nomination, and he had many qualities which made him very appealing to a cross-section of voters in the United States. Eugene McCarthy, a Democratic senator from Minnesota, announced his candidacy to run against Lyndon Johnson. In November of 1967, he was running largely in opposition to President Johnson's policies in Vietnam. President Johnson, although he had not declared his candidacy officially, was presumed by almost everyone to be running for re-election. And therefore, his announcement later in this year that he was withdrawing from the presidential race came as a great shock to people. Richard Nixon, as shown in this announcement episode, announced his candidacy at the end of January 1968. And George Wallace, the former Democratic governor of Alabama, was running in this particular race as an independent for the presidency. And in February, he announced his candidacy and was in pursuit of securing access to all the ballots in the 50 states so that he could run nationally as a presidential candidate. In addition to these declared candidacies or presumed candidacy in the case of Lyndon Johnson, there were other prospective candidates looming in the background who eventually entered the race in 1968. Robert F. Kennedy entered on March 16, 1968, shortly after the March 12, 1968 New Hampshire primary, in which Eugene McCarthy won a hefty share of the vote on the Democratic side and scared really Lyndon Johnson and his supporters about the strength of his support in that state. Nelson Rockefeller, a Republican, then the governor of New York, declared his candidacy on April the 30th after having first declared that he was not going to run on March 21st of that same year. He was basically running on a campaign that can be summed up in 3 words: Nixon can't win. He was using Nixon's image as a loser to say that while he liked Dick Nixon personally, he felt that Dick Nixon could not win the presidency against the Democratic nominee, and that he was a superior candidate and more electable in a general election. Ronald Reagan, who was elected governor of California in 1966, loomed impressively in the background as the darling of conservatives. And he was really the torch carrier of the Goldwater campaign, but had a personality that was more appealing to voters than Barry Goldwater did. George Romney, as I mentioned, was considered to be a very viable candidate for the presidency when he announced in early 1967 and campaigned throughout that year. But he gave an interview on television at the end of August of 1967, in which he made a statement to the effect that he had been brainwashed while on a trip to Vietnam, and that explained why his views on Vietnam had changed. This statement, this admission on his part, doomed his candidacy. His appeal to voters collapsed, and he eventually withdrew from the presidential race before the New Hampshire primary was held. Listen to what he had to say in this interview on television that he granted at the end of August of 1967.
Governor, shifting to Vietnam in November of 1965, when you returned from Vietnam, you said, and I'm quoting, "Involvement was morally right and necessary and probably reversed the shift in the balance of power greater than if Hitler had conquered Europe." In recent weeks, you said you didn't think we should have been involved at all, and that President Johnson's decision to expand the bombing wasn't going to resolve the problem. Isn't your position a bit inconsistent with what it was, and what do you propose we do now?
Well, you know, when I came back from Vietnam, I just had the greatest brainwashing that anybody can get.
By the generals?
When you go over to Vietnam, well, not only by the generals, but also by the diplomatic corps over there. And they do a very thorough job. And since returning from Vietnam, I've gone into the history of Vietnam all the way back into World War II and before. And as a result, I have changed my mind in that particular. I no longer believe that it was necessary for us to get involved in South Vietnam to stop communist aggression in Southeast Asia and to prevent communist domination Chinese communist domination of Southeast Asia. And I've indicated that I think it was tragic that we became involved in the conflict there, and that if General Eisenhower had remained President of the United States, I don't think we would have become involved in a land war in Southeast Asia. But despite that fact, we're there, we are involved, we have created this into a conflict that is now a test between communism and freedom there, and this is part of the complexity and difficulty of the situation. And furthermore, we've involved other nations in Southeast Asia, and we have to deal with it on the basis of the current circumstances rather than on what might have been if there hadn't been an overreaction in military terms in dealing with the Vietnamese problem.
It's interesting that Senator Eugene McCarthy responded to Romney's comment about being brainwashed by ridiculing him, saying that, in effect, Romney didn't need to be brainwashed, that a light rinse would have done enough.
Governor.
In 1968, Richard Nixon also experimented with a new approach to campaigning, trying to present the so-called new Nixon in that year, in which he would be a little bit more polished in how he appeared in situations addressing the issues. The technique that was developed through a new media team that he put together that included Lynn Garment, who worked with him as a partner in the law firm Nixon Mudge, and also Roger Ailes, who went on to Fox News fame, was to present the presidential candidate, Nixon, in a setting with a hand-picked audience facing a citizen panel of questioners that would ask him questions in the news. It mimicked an official news conference, but was not. These were generally not reporters, although they would invite maybe one reporter from the outside to be part of the citizens panel. And this was used on several occasions throughout the 1968 campaign, both in the primary season and in the general election, and first tried in New Hampshire at Hillsborough on February 2nd or February 3rd, sometime about there. There isn't a video of that I could find, but this is a video based on a similar event held in Michigan later that year, that went under the label the Nixon Answer. And the excerpt from this gives you a feel for how this was portrayed at that particular point in time. And then another interesting thing about this particular segment is that it deals with the issue of student demonstrations, which are particularly relevant today, as we've seen over the protest on college campuses over the Gaza war with Israel at this particular stage.
Mr. Bittner.
Mr. Nixon, because of the recent widespread demonstrations and disruptions on American campuses, there seems to be quite a bit of public pressure now on campus administrators to get tough and to crack down on the student rebels. What is your view in general on the role of dissent in society, and in particular, the role of dissent on the college campus?
I'm for it. I'm for dissent because as I look back over the 190-year history of this country, as I'm sure you have as a student at Ann Arbor, I find that dissent is the great instrument of change. It's the instrument of progress. And that's what really distinguishes a free society from the totalitarian societies. We change those things by reason of the dissent that are wrong. We aren't frozen into them. On the other hand, when we look at dissent, we have to recognize that it can also be an instrument of destruction if it does not follow a certain rule that we should all understand, provided we look at our American political system. Now, I've talked in a number of university campuses, and I've had some university and college students say, when I point out that I think that there should be peaceful dissent and not breaking the law, they said, well, don't you believe in the American Revolution? And I said, I certainly do. But I point out that those who participated in the American Revolution had no peaceful way to redress their grievances. They had to have a revolution in order to do it. And then our founding fathers had the genius to set up a system of government which provides a method for peaceful change. Only once in the history of our country, 100 years ago in the Civil War, did that not work. And then we had to resort to warfare in order to resolve the differences. But when you have a system that provides a peaceful method in which to change what we don't like, I don't believe there's any cause that justifies breaking the law or engaging in violence. And I think we should get that across to all Americans. I believe it's essential to get that across, particularly in the college campuses, because those who come from the colleges and the universities are going to be the thought leaders in the future. They have to go back to their communities, and they have to make clear that while we believe in vigorous dissent, that on the other hand, that when we engage in violence, when we break the law, we destroy, in effect, the very system that we're attempting to build. Mr. Bittner.
Mr. Nixon, because of the...
Let's take a look back at the United States in 1968 from a broader cultural perspective. One of the most popular movies in that year was The Graduate, starring Dustin Hoffman. The most popular television show in the first part of that year was the Andy Griffith half-hour show. A very popular singer who had several major hits that year was Aretha Franklin. The population of the United States in 1968, in January, was about 196 million people, and the gross domestic product was $908 billion. Compared to today, with a population of well over 300 million, and the gross domestic product of over 28 trillion. Life was much simpler. Think about a time in which you did not have personal computers, in which you did not have the internet, in which you did not have email, and also in which you did not have cell phones. Oh, how I wish for those days on many days today. There were some popular commercials which give you an additional flavor for the United States in 1968. One was for Wisk, and another was for cars being sold by General Motors, including the Chevrolet Impala. Let's listen to these commercials to sort of fill you in what it was like watching TV back then.
Ring around the collar, ring around the collar.
Those
dirty rings. You try soaking them out, and soaping them out, and scrubbing them out. And you can still get. Now, try Wisk. Wisk sinks right into the dirt, starts to clean before you start to wash. Use Wisk, and you won't hear ring around the collar again. Wisk.
General Motors.
Impala, a powerful surprise. Camaro, a comfortable surprise. Chevelle, a roomy surprise. With Impala, you know you're getting a beautiful car and a Chevy smooth ride. But you're surprised at how silent Impala rides. How much power the 307 cubic inch standard V8 delivers when you need it. That's Impala, a powerful surprise. Sure, you expected your Camaro, the hugger, to be sporty and agile. But you never thought Camaro would feel and act like a much bigger car. Independent coil spring front suspension, Camaro's wide stance, wider tread, a redesigned suspension, give it a big car road-hugging ride. The hugger is a comfortable surprise. They picked the new 1968 Chevelle Fourth Sedan.
A little bit about myself. I might say in regard to that last commercial from General Motors, in 1968, if I recall correctly, we didn't have mandatory fasten seatbelt laws. Your cars did not have seat belts. And when you drove with your parents as a kid, as I was then, you just sat in the back seat with your brother or sister, and you flopped around as the car drove down the street over bumps and other interferences on the road. It was quite a different time. And I think one of the signs of progress is that we ended up with seat belts after concerns about the safety of auto travel. Well, I'm Merrick Masters, and this tells you a little bit about myself, my interests, which are business, labor, and politics, a forthcoming podcast that I'm going to launch in September of this year called Masters and Votes, the Business of Politics, which I hope you'll look out for. My background as a professor in universities and the various administrative positions I've held, a sample of some of the books I've written, and the fact that I was a Democratic candidate for the nomination in the old 18th Congressional District of Pennsylvania. You can find me on YouTube, Merrick Masters at Merrick Masters, or X or Twitter. Thank you. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Nixon's the One.